The list of Soviet myths about World War II is truly enormous. Recently, I told you about the feat of the 28 Panfilov heroes, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a complete fake invented in the editorial office of Krasnaya Zvezda. Today, I'll continue this theme by looking at a few more such stories that almost every adult in the post-Soviet world has known since childhood. You will find out what Aleksandr Matrosov's real name was, what happened to Captain Gastello's body, and where the famous story about the battle near the village of Duvankoy came from, when 5 Soviet sailors supposedly stopped as many as 22 German tanks. My name is Semyon, this is the Megashow TV channel. Let's get started. Aleksandr Matrosov, with his chest against the embrasure. Aleksandr Matrosov's feat is generally well known. It was covered so widely in newspapers, movies, and literature that the Russian language even developed a set phrase, to throw oneself on the embrasure with one's chest. Despite this, out of all Soviet military myths, the story of Aleksandr Matrosov is probably the closest to real events. And here it's important to understand exactly how the USSR used this to support its lies. According to the official version, the battalion where the future hero served was assigned to capture the village of Chernushki, not far from Pskov. On the approaches to it, there was an enemy pillbox that, with heavy machine gun fire, thwarted all attacks by the Red Army soldiers. Matrosov and another soldier were assigned to destroy the enemy machine gun. On the approaches to the pillbox, Comrade Matrosov was seriously wounded, and then Aleksandr decided to complete the mission alone. He crept up to the embrasure and threw 2 grenades into it. The machine gun fell silent. But as soon as the soldiers rose to attack, the pillbox opened fire again. Then Matrosov stood up and covered the embrasure with his own body. Thus, at the cost of his own life, he supposedly contributed to the accomplishment of the unit's combat mission. It should be added that Matrosov performed his heroic deed in his very first battle, which also became his last. Now, about how it all really happened. As I already mentioned, what Matrosov did is very close to what really happened. He really did die. In February 1943, during the assault on the village of Chernushki near Pskov, he suppressed or destroyed an enemy pillbox before his death. However, it is unlikely that he threw himself chest first onto the embrasure, because such an action is absolutely pointless, considering that a machine gun burst would shatter a wooden log into splinters. It could instantly turn a human body into bloody mince. There are several versions of how exactly Matrosov managed to silence the German pillbox for a while, the main goal being to destroy the enemy pillbox. In the final moments, Aleksandr was seen on the roof of the pillbox, and then his body was found in the snow in front of it. It is possible that while being above the machine gun crew, Matrosov tried to destroy it with a grenade or by firing his personal weapon. By doing so, he distracted the machine gunners, giving his comrades time to approach the pillbox. The writer and frontline soldier Viktor Ostafyev, referring to eyewitnesses of the event, claims that Matrosov slid onto the embrasure from the roof of the pillbox and tried to press the long machine gun barrel to the ground. He was killed, but the attack by Soviet troops was successful and the village was liberated. It could also have been that he simply slipped, since it was winter, fell and blocked the machine gunner's view. Whatever the case, it's impossible to say for sure now. However, out of all the likely scenarios, Soviet propaganda chose the least realistic but the most inhuman one. They claimed that Matrosov, defying death, covered the machine gun embrasure with his own body. Overall, this is not surprising, since propagandists were usually far from the front lines and had a hard time imagining what was really happening there. The first to write about the feat of Aleksandr Matrosov was the war correspondent Mikhail Bubanov. Later, it was widely publicized by Soviet propaganda, of course as an example to follow. And it started to work. By the end of 1943, another 38 Red Army soldiers had thrown themselves onto machine guns. In 1944, there were 87 of them, and in 1945, 46. The last of Matrosov's followers covered an embrasure with his body on a street in Berlin, literally just a few hours before victory. According to other sources, during the war, more than 400 Soviet servicemen repeated or attempted to repeat Matrosov's feat. Matrosov himself was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union in June 1943. Matrosov's feat, or rather its widely publicized description, was extremely convenient for the Soviet leadership and fit perfectly into the ideological framework. For example, the Germans didn't have to throw themselves onto machine guns. They destroyed enemy firing positions with artillery and air power, sent tanks forward that smashed Soviet fortifications to pieces, and only then did the infantry advance. And all because the Nazis still tried to preserve their troops and didn't throw soldiers into insane frontal assaults. But for Soviet generals, human wave assaults were a favorite tactical method throughout the entire war, and those who refused to take part in them were shot by barrier troops or their own commanders. After all, even the creator of the Red Army, Comrade Trotsky, said that before an attack, soldiers should choose between possible death ahead and inevitable death behind. Frontal assaults on machine guns were practiced in the Red Army until the very end of the war. One known case occurred when, during the assault on the Silo Heights, a battalion tried to take the only German pillbox by attacking it head-on. All the company and platoon commanders in the battalion had already been knocked out, and fewer than 100 soldiers remained. And suddenly, the machine gun fell silent. It turned out that the German machine gunner had simply gone insane or was in a state of shock, unable to withstand the sight of piles of corpses and soldiers, the cries of the dying. What happened to Captain Gastello's body? The story of Captain Gastello's fiery ramming is another heroic myth that made its way into all Soviet textbooks about World War II. To begin with, a few words about the feat itself. In the first weeks of the war, Soviet aviation suffered colossal losses. Thousands of planes were destroyed right on the airfields, without even having time to take off. Therefore, long-range bombers, which were intended for completely different purposes, had to be used to strike at German columns. These huge heavy machines were designed to strike deep behind enemy lines from high altitudes. They actually began to be used as ground attack aircraft, and moreover, without any fighter cover. The official version of the myth states that on June 26, 1941, a flight of DB-3F long-range bombers under the command of Captain Gastello took off on a mission from an airfield near the village of Pukovici. The pilots were tasked with carrying out a bombing strike on a German column that was moving along the Molodechno-Radashkovici road. Immediately after completing the bombing, Gastello's plane was hit. Not wanting to surrender to the enemy, he directed his burning plane straight into a cluster of enemy vehicles and died a hero's death. The correspondents of the newspaper Pravda relished the feat and death of Captain Gastello with a kind of almost sadistic pleasure. Slip away while there's still time. To come down by parachute and find yourself in enemy-occupied territory, only to surrender to humiliating captivity. No, that's not an option. Down to the ground toward the clustered enemy fuel tanks, he hurled the fiery wreck of his plane. The fire is already near the pilot, but the ground is close. Gastello's eyes, tormented by the flames, still see that his scorched hands are steady. The dying plane still obeys the hand of the dying pilot. So now, life will end not in an accident, not in captivity, but in a heroic deed. We remember the hero's name, Captain Nikolai Frantsevich Gastello. His family lost a son and a husband. The motherland gained a hero. Soviet propaganda did everything it could to publicize Gastello's fiery ramming, turning it into one of the most famous examples of true heroism. Very quickly, the main Soviet kamikaze gained followers, who were immediately nicknamed Gastello followers. During the war, there were a total of 595 classic aerial rammings, 506 rammings of ground targets with aircraft and 16 naval rammings, and even 160 tank rammings. Gastello himself was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union in July 1941 posthumously, but the members of his crew were forgotten. Only in 1958 were they posthumously awarded the Orders of the Patriotic War First Class. And everything seemed to be fine. Until 1951, on the 10th anniversary of the feat, someone came up with the idea to exhume the heroes' bodies for a ceremonial reburial. However, alas, surprisingly, the body of Captain Gastello, the hero, was not found in the grave. Instead, the remains of the crew from another DB-3F bomber were discovered, which also bombed the Nazi convoy on June 26, 1941, and was considered missing in action. This aircraft was commanded by Captain Maslov, a friend of Gastello. In that battle, his bomber was also hit. Moreover, witnesses were found who saw that Maslov, in his burning bomber, really tried to ram. but he didn't make it to the highway by a few hundred meters. Probably, that's how the legend of the fiery ramming was born, which was later attributed to the flight leader, Gastello. I'm sure that those who dug up the grave were not pleased by such findings. By that time, Gastello was considered one of the most respected heroes of the war. His name was in all the textbooks. Hundreds of streets, collective farms, and pioneer squads were named after the pilot. And then there was such an embarrassment. The hero's body was missing, and instead, the remains of servicemen who were listed as missing in action were found. Back then, people like that were automatically suspected of treason. Their families didn't get the pension and benefits they deserved. That's a bit of a digression. The discovered remains were reburied quietly without much fuss. The relatives of the deceased finally received the death certificates and the due payments. As for the circumstances of Gastello's feat, an investigation was launched. Gastello's plane was eventually found. However, it was not at the supposed site of the heroic act, but 25 kilometers away from it. Its wreckage lay in a swamp, not far from the small village of Matsky. At the crash site, the personal belongings of Gastello's crew members were found. But most importantly, they found an engine tag with a serial number, which made it possible to accurately identify the plane. Moreover, there were witnesses who confirmed that on June 26, 1941, a Soviet pilot from a downed bomber parachuted into the village. However, soon the Germans arrived, captured him, and took him away. There's another important point here. The design features of the DB-3F bomber were such that if it was shot down, only the commander of the aircraft had a chance to escape and parachute out. That means Gastello. For the rest of the crew, the plane meant death. The plane turned into a mass grave. After studying the wreckage of the bomber, the investigators came to a simple but very unpleasant conclusion. If Gastello's plane is lying in the swamp, then it couldn't have exploded on the highway together with the German fuel trucks. The ramming was probably attempted by another crew, but even that wasn't very successful. The fallen hero himself, glorified by Soviet propaganda, not only didn't perform his feat, but most likely, which is shameful for Soviet propaganda, ended up in German captivity. The findings turned out to be so scandalous that the investigation was classified. The witnesses were intimidated. The wreckage of Maslov's plane was passed off as the remains of the hero's aircraft and handed over to the museum. And in 1976, a majestic monument was erected at the site of Captain Gastello's supposed feat. We will hardly ever learn about the fate of Gastello himself. Most likely, it was a tragic one. In 1941, the Germans took several million prisoners on the Eastern Front. Most of them did not survive the winter of 1941 to 1942. The battle near the village of Duvankoy, tankman Kobzar and Shironin's guardsmen. The story of Captain Gastello or Aleksandr Matrosov are the most famous, the most promoted military myths by Soviet propaganda. In reality, there were hundreds of them. But most of them are known today only to historians or local historians. For example, during Soviet times, there was a very popular story about the battle near the village of Duvankoy, when 5 sailors led by Commissar Felchenkov supposedly stopped 24 German tanks on their way to Sevastopol, destroying half of them. And they did this practically with their bare hands, meaning without artillery or even anti-tank rifles, only with grenades and Molotov cocktails. This heroic deed first became known from the article "The Feat of 5 Sailors," which appeared in the newspaper Krasny Flot on May 14, 1942. The author of the entire account was someone named Meyer Kagut, a senior political officer and head of the Agitation and Propaganda Department. Even during Soviet times, this story began to raise certain questions, especially among those who had at least some understanding of how dangerous a tank is in battle and how difficult it is to destroy one. It's generally difficult to disable a tank with a grenade, because it has machine guns that simply won't let a soldier get close enough to throw one. In addition, tanks in battle are covered by infantry, who keep a sharp eye out to make sure nothing dangerous or explosive is thrown at them. However, even a grenade or a Molotov cocktail that hit a tank by no means guaranteed its destruction. Shaped charge grenades didn't exist then. They either threw bundles of regular anti-personnel grenades or anti-tank RPG-40 grenades, which only differed from them in size. However, even in the case of a successful hit, you could break a tank's track, jam its turret, or concuss the crew, but it would still continue to fight, and the first thing it would do, of course, is destroy the grenadier himself. The main means of fighting enemy armored vehicles in that war was anti-tank artillery, and the story about destroying as many as 10 tanks with grenades belongs in the realm of science fiction. During Soviet times, people avoided such questions due to possible serious consequences. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, professional historians and just enthusiasts really wanted to find out what actually happened near Duvankoy on November 7, 1941. And it turned out that there are no documents about this in either the Soviet or German archives. The 18th Marine Battalion really did operate in the Belbek River Valley, but there's not a word about repelling a tank attack. And Red Navy sailor Grigory Zamykovsky, who received a medal for bravery for participating in those battles, claimed that there was definitely no battle with tanks that day. But the most interesting thing is this. Manstein's 11th Army, which was fighting in Crimea at that time, didn't have any tanks at all. Therefore, it's unclear what Commissar Felchenko and his comrades were actually blowing up. The Germans did have an assault gun battalion in Crimea, but during that period it was somewhere near Bakhchisarai and definitely did not take part in the battles near Sevastopol. The story of the battle near Duvankoy is most likely made up from beginning to end. It was published in May 1942, 6 months after the events described. Only because at that time the Crimean front was defeated and it was necessary to somehow boost the soldiers' morale. But the most astonishing thing is that even now, after all the revelations, many Russian websites still describe the feat of the Soviet Marines at Duvankoy, copying the old myth word for word. The fate of the article's author turned out to be tragic. Meyer Naumovich Kagut is officially listed as missing in action as of July 3, 1942. That was the last day of the defense of Sevastopol, when 100,000 Soviet soldiers were abandoned by their command and trapped at Cape Chersonis. It is clear that for a person with such initials, even captivity meant certain death. Not all Soviet myths were invented from start to finish. Often they were based on a real event, which was then greatly embellished by propagandists. An example is the story of the tank hero Kobzar, who during the Battle of Kursk personally destroyed 24 German tanks in a single battle. Such a battle really did take place, and the Germans actually suffered heavy losses in it. However, the catch is that it was not Kobzar himself who destroyed the enemy tanks, but an entire company under his command. Moreover, pilots, artillerymen, and infantry also contributed to the destruction of German armored vehicles. Other units of the 200th Tank Brigade, which included Kobzar's company, also helped. And the story about the tank hero appeared later and was promoted by Soviet propaganda. By the way, Kobzar died in that battle, burning in his tank. So there's no doubt about his heroism and personal courage. But why lie about it? An interesting point. A few years ago, the Russian Minister of Culture told a story about the tank hero Kobzar at a meeting with Putin. And then he suggested naming one of the new tanks after him. It is possible that Russian viewers will soon see another heroic blockbuster in the spirit of the 28 Panfilov Guardsmen and T-34. In the video about the feat of the Panfilov Guardsmen, I already mentioned that I am surprised by the desire of Russians to dust off old Soviet tall tales. Although the history of the war is already full of real events, true heroism, and self-sacrifice, is it really that hard to work in the archives? Or is it just an attitude toward people, treating them like dumb cattle? Well, never mind. Another example of embellishing reality was the feat of Lieutenant Shironin's platoon, which distinguished itself in the battles for the liberation of Kharkov in March 1943. It was first reported in the divisional bulletin, Stalin's Guard. Then the story was picked up by other publications, including the newspaper Pravda. Moreover, each article was filled with more and more incredible details. In the final version, it seemed that Shironin's platoon fought for 4 days against dozens of German tanks, destroying 16 enemy vehicles and more than 100 Nazis. The lack of artillery, the only 45mm gun was destroyed on the second day. The soldiers made up for it with courage and a willingness to sacrifice themselves. They tied grenades to themselves and threw themselves en masse under the tanks. Only 6 soldiers survived. All the soldiers were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. In reality, Shironin's group was assigned to take an advanced position to lure German tanks and infantry toward them, where they came under fire from divisional artillery, Katyusha rocket launchers, and Soviet tanks. The mission was accomplished, but according to the documents, the group was wiped out completely. All the soldiers were posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. There are detailed historical investigations of this case based on archival documents. Again, it's hard not to call these people heroes, but again, why lie about it? Conclusion. I've already said that military propaganda is a terrible thing. During war, the most unbelievable stories are invented, and what's most interesting is that people believe them. However, when the psychosis passes, the myths are debunked or simply forgotten over time. For some reason, this didn't work in the Soviet Union. There, stories about Gastello or Matrosov were told right up until the very end of the Soviet Union. And in Putin's Russia, people are still trying to spread similar myths today. Another important point. Heroism in war by some is usually the result of cowardice or blundering by others. Of course, there are exceptions, but they only prove the rule. The Germans didn't have to throw themselves under tanks with grenades or cover embrasures with their bodies, because they knew how to fight by skill, not by numbers. Soviet generals, on the other hand, plugged any gaps with cannon fodder whose minds had been thoroughly washed by relentless propaganda. Yes, it was a people's war. As always, it was fought with the people themselves.
Goodbye, everyone.
Пока.